Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mentor Talk, the unique destination for insightful conversations with experienced professionals. I'm your host, Suzette, the CEO of Sales Pro for You, and more about me as usual during this episode. So, without further delay, let's start into today's enlightening conversation with Stephen Sinclair. So, Stephen, hello, and welcome to this episode of the Mentor Talk. It's really nice to meet you.
Hello, Suzette. Nice to meet you too. I'm looking forward to the next 20 minutes.
Okay, let's try to be, on time. Okay, and before we start our lively discussion, I would like to summarize your broad and also very diverse expertise in a nutshell, so that our listeners and viewers know who is with me today in the room. So if I am right, and if not, please correct me, your journey started as a researcher in the electronics industry, and you have a passion for sound with respect to the filmmaking industry. Anyhow, as a sales expert with more than, I would say, 30 years of experience, I hope I'm not making you older than you are, in the technology industry, you sold data automation and platform-based solutions while working for financial companies, for example, like JP Morgan, Barclays Banks, or Santander. Lately, you worked for Undo, a software debugging company, if I'm right, as a sales director for the EMEA region. And currently, to close this chapter, you are supporting Dynatrace, an Austrian funded tech company, which provides awesome software intelligence solution using AI. So finally, to close this, you love building solutions for people using intelligent automations to deliver answers from data. So I hope this is correct.
Very good. Two small things. I no longer work for Dynatrace. In fact, I stopped working with them back in March, and I've been on a different journey since then, which is why we're talking. I've kind of decided to swing back to something that I did in the past. But yeah, very good summary. Absolutely right. I forgot we talked about my time with sound and sound recording in the film industry. Very quickly, I'll tell you of a time I spent with David Bowie on a sound stage at Shepperton Studios. So I've had a fun life, and when I look back, yeah, 30 years is nice. Thank you. We'll stick with 30. It's actually over 30. So I no longer work for Dynatrace. And in terms of I haven't worked in the likes of Barclays. I've sold to the likes of Barclays and JP Morgan and worked with them, not for them. Just things can be taken out of context. But I mean, interestingly, my background really started in sales in my pre-teens, when I worked in a car and servicing shop. And it taught me a number of sales lessons in reality. One of those was understanding customer needs. The other was finding solutions to their problems, managing their expectations, and providing value. I don't want an OEM part. Can I have something that's cheaper? I also had a couple of other part-time jobs, which involved dealing with people and pricing strategies. And that's probably more for a conversation over a drink or two, but that was kind of fun foundation. But it also helped me understand what engages people in their decision-making process, how to handle objections, and also how to handle complaints, because obviously, when complaints come along, how do you deal with them? And I did that at a very early age. It's kind of scary. So the 30 years is kind of nice, but it's much broader. Interestingly, though, as you've just mentioned, I started my adult life in research and development for Marconi Space Defense Systems. It was a technical role working on some pretty diverse solutions. And about 6, maybe 7 years in, I left Marconi to become freelance. So I was doing much the same thing from a freelance perspective, but with my own business. And that meant obviously finding opportunities. So there's a sales element with that. And that was fun. And I worked with IBM. I worked with Plessey, who were a counterpart of Marconi, the Harris Corporation, which is kind of an interesting one, and Dictaphone. And the reason I mentioned Dictaphone, there were others, but those are some of the key big players. But it was Dictaphone where I really returned to full-time selling. And it came about after an interesting meeting with a group of C-level executives at one of the world's largest trading houses. You've just mentioned their name, but I won't mention it again because of the story. And I mention this really because the meeting had also various C-level executives from within Dictaphone attending that meeting. And there was a serious issue that really was potentially impacting a multi-million-pound project. It was a showstopper. It was fix it or lose it. And in that meeting, you could truly cut the tension with a sword. You know, it was that thick. The tension in the room was that thick. And the issue was with a particular part of a platform that enabled this large trading environment to operate during the day. And when it failed, which it did randomly, they had a policy that they couldn't trade. So you can imagine the amount of money that it was potentially costing them. There were several other key points to cover in the meeting. And I think I've just mentioned sort of focusing, but when you have a meeting that's 1 hour long and you have a room full of executives and you have people that don't turn up on time, you have to do the introductions, the usual stuff. You don't have an hour. You maybe have at best, maybe 45 minutes. And this wasn't a meeting where you could take the conversation after as you walk back to reception. This was very much a meeting, solve this problem, lose the project. And
Stephen, sorry, I have to quickly interrupt you. So your position in the meeting was you were the problem solver, right?
Well, I became the problem solver. I wasn't the problem solver at the time. Actually, this was one of my freelance projects with Dictaphone. I was working on the project they had with Amstrad, which was very much about traveling the country to people's homes and businesses and changing out the computers they had. And because of my electronics background, and with another colleague, we took a different approach to it. So I think for this particular meeting, I'd been now employed by Dictaphone. And so I was responsible for the project. And it's so long ago, memories fade a little bit. So I think my responsibility was as the regional sales manager for that account. So there was a vested interest on my part to make sure this worked. But what became really apparent was we had these 14 issues that we had to cover and this one very critical problem to resolve.
You mean 14 or 40? 40?
1-4.
Okay, but it's already enough.
Yeah. And as I say, with probably less than 45 minutes in reality, what suddenly dawned on me is that we needed to focus on the issues that we could talk about and resolve quickly. And we did that. Everybody agreed to do that. And as a result of that, when we got to the one problem, the tension in the room had subsided an awful lot. The tension had really gone. People were being, jovial. And I then came up with the solution. And it's a very simple one. It really is a very simple one. But to find out what the simple solution is, you'll need to engage with me and we can cover it over a drink or two, So, but it was a very, very straightforward one that meant we bought them time to solve the solution from a software perspective. We gave the trading environment the ability to trade comfortably during operating hours. I made an awful lot of money out of it, so I'm not complaining. But we saved the contract. In fact, as a result of that, we grew the contract. And I've seen that in my sales career quite often. When you come across problems, the way you as a team approach them is how and how you solve them is how you then build out sometimes greater trust. And that brings in much greater referrals. So that team referred us to another department and we grew that. So it's kind of interesting that at that point, I was approached by the sales director who said, you'd be good in sales full time, you know, in another department. Would you be interested in that? And that's kind of really where I transitioned back from a support technical role, research and development kind of scenario, back into full-time selling. That was a good 30 years ago. And as you say, the rest is sort of history, you know.
Just another question, you know, with respect to this, let's say, very intense meeting, right? You were participating in. So I guess you learned during this meeting also how to deal with people, right? I mean, this is the one of the most crucial parts. I mean, you told you saved them time, or you gave them time, right? I mean, to be successful and to solve this issue with this program, with the software you just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a real value to that, because it gave the company supplying the solution from memory several months to come up with a resolution. But it gave the company that were utilizing the solution, which, by the way, was unique. We had transitioned from reel-to-reel tape recording to DAT technology. So this was a bank of DAT recorders that was brand new somewhat to the market. And so there was a real value in that, because now I can trade, and I know that if I need to, I can go and recall those recordings. So there was a governance element to that, and a mitigation against risk. So that was really important. And I think when I reflect on that, a lot of the issues at the time was this tension. And so when you get tension, you tend to mentally close down. So it's about paying attention to the environment you're in. That's why I mentioned the 14 points. We could have gone through them because they were listed 1 to 14, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. We'd have been there all day. We didn't have all day. But I, you know, sort of skipping forward from that. So I joined as a regional sales manager. I kind of mentioned that earlier on. We had some interesting approaches then. Every 90 days, we swapped around who was dealing with what organizations they were dealing with, which was a challenge. Unless you were in the process of completing paperwork, you had to move your accounts around, kind of challenging. But I've had the real pleasure of engaging with and negotiating with generals, presidents of countries. I've done meetings in Bedouin tents with princes.
Wow.
I've had some fun. I've had some fun along the way.
Okay, Stephen, I have to interrupt you again because it's so interesting. Another question, you just mentioned the part of the importance of negotiation. So I guess this is a key, right? This is a key, let's say, challenge a lot of people are trying to solve if they are working in sales. So do you have any kind of advice with respect to negotiation?
There are a lot of things. You have to have empathy for the environment that you're in. You have to have, you know, 2 ears, 1 mouth. I'm talking a lot now because that's the nature of what we're doing, but it's very much about listening. I'm watching you for visual cues so that you can stop and ask me questions. It's about objection handling, as I mentioned earlier on, and objections come at you in many differing ways. It's about being a trusted advisor. It's about knowing what you're selling well enough to be able to counter those objections as they come to you. And in many cases, actually, if you have done your research, you're ahead of those objections. So you're covering them before people ask. I get very animated, so I'm trying not to do that today, but it's about making sure that what you're presenting on a screen is understood. If you're using terms, don't assume that everyone in that room knows what you're talking about, especially when you talk about startups, SMEs, and scale-ups. If this is a new product that's been brought to market, there's a good chance the people you're selling to do not know much, if anything, about what you're proposing. And that's kind of interesting, because if I think back about the solutions I've sold over time, I've grown great relationships that still last to this day. I go and drink with people, although there's one guy that might watch this and says, Steve doesn't really drink. I drink 3 pints to his 1. I'm, you know, but if he's having fun, that's good. So he knows who he is.
Yes, because you succeeded on this socializing part, right? And this is one of the most important things. So you have to go out and have a beer at least. I mean, also if you're not a heavy drinker, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are other things we could talk about, but to keep it focused, yeah, you're absolutely right. But then I had a chap call me recently who I worked with maybe 8 years ago, asking me for some statistics because he wanted to present them back to his board, because they were looking to buy a solution, and he wanted to understand pieces of information that we had worked on together before to build up his presentation. Actually, just very quickly on that, the solution that we sold to him helped them save through the knowledge, spending on a product that they thought they needed to purchase. And in fact, from the interactions with their customers, they quickly realized that they needed to spend somewhere else. And they did that, and to much success, actually. So, I mean, I've had, like I say, diverse range of roles. You mentioned that. I've been regional sales manager, director, sales director, head of sales, commercial manager, commercial account manager. I've done a broad spectrum across my time, but my experience has been predominantly in startup and scale-up organizations. Although, as I mentioned earlier on, I've worked in some of the world's leading organizations too.
Okay, another question with respect to the communication and also negotiation in general, I mean, building relationships with people. In your CV, if I'm right, there's a note about you have been the sales manager for the EMEA. So this means it's a complete other mentality, if I'm right. So
you're absolutely right. Interestingly, in terms of from a sales perspective, I started out making my own cold calls, picking up the phone, reaching out to people, and I can go back to the time when the phones were big bricks, but different ways of doing things. And I've then sort of progressed on to working with sales development representatives and BDRs, marketing teams for account-based marketing, and various other events. All of these things come together. They're part of the sales process. And pipeline generation, of course, has to be focused and meaningful. I've also had the great pleasure of working with partners, various partners, very value-added resellers and systems integrators, but in different locations. So to just come to that point, I did a lot of time in Paris and some time in Hamburg. Unfortunately, I only speak one language, but so that's a challenge because you have to be sure, again, that you're thinking through what you're presenting to the people you're presenting to. They pick up the nuances of what you're covering. So I've done a little bit of sales training and sales enablement from a coaching perspective in those regions. And then when I've been taken in as, from a sales perspective, as the representative of the company with that partner into Germany, BMW comes to mind, interestingly. You sit in that room, and again, you're listening to the things that matter to them, the points that are going to change their view of the organization that you're talking about. And often you'll have somebody there that translates. I think the hardest one I can recall in recent times was in Nice in France, where very few people spoke English, and myself and my sales engineer didn't speak French. We got by, it wasn't the easiest of things. I mean, I recall another scenario where, in fact, the conversation was in Russian, which then was discussed in Hebrew, and the answer came from me in English.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that was fun. That's a long time ago, but that was fun. That was fun, actually. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I see the challenges for startups is many and varied, but it's often bringing a unique idea or an invention to market. And you have very clever inventors, founders who feel passionate about what they do. And something that they've created, they clearly want to take to market. They want to build their business. And these people often put their lives on the line. They remortgage their houses. One guy I worked with, I'm pretty sure he said it was 20 credit cards. It was a large number of credit cards he used to keep the business viable. Now that's passion for you. So for me, what I see is sales pro for you and freelance experts stepping up to help move the needle for these people, to help them focus. Often they're not comfortable presenting. Often they know very well what it is that they've invented, the solution, the platform, the product, but they're not quite sure how to transition that into the market. And so it's working with them to understand. I was just having this conversation with my son, actually. It's about understanding how you take that to market. Where do you spend the seeding funds that have come in? Where does that go? Does it go on product? Does it go on building out the engine, building out the team, and then realizing you've got this great team, but the product doesn't quite do what it should do, and so you have to scale back on the team. Those are big challenges.
Exactly. So Stephen, that's why you are so important. I mean, you personally also, and also your expertise, to help such startups or scale-ups to grow, especially, I mean, of course, in sales, but also in different fields. I mean, you could also just advise, on how to work with people or potential customers, having a different mentality. This is already, a challenge for people who just, as you just said, speak only one language, or did not even, traveled abroad so often, or got in touch with different mentalities. So this is very, very helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, a CEO founder will have to adapt to the business drivers. I mean, such a strategy, investor management, managing the business accounts, the business plan for growth. There's so many things under, helping that product grow. And they need to make sure the business is heading in the right direction. But they'll also need to come out of their comfort zone. They'll need, in the early days in particular, to get involved with selling. If I think back to my time in knowledge management, going out with the CEO was an absolute blessing, because he knew everything about his product, everything about that solution. And so you're able to pick up on that. And that's another thing that is often overlooked. For me, one of the core pillars in a startup or a small organization, even in a scale up, actually, that core pillar is trust, is trusting in the people you have around you, is realizing that your expertise is not, their expertise. And one of the things I've taught my children, and I've often talked about with, again, potentially people who know me will remember this, is no matter how much you impart your knowledge to someone, they will never be you. You are unique. And that's good. That's actually really good. But it's letting go sometimes and letting other people do what they do well. It's having that trust in them. And I can think of someone that it took them around 2 years on average to get to trust people. But again, come back to that point. These people have often invested everything into this idea, into this invention. And so, you as in my case, as a sales director or a head of sales or as a sales guy, I have to appreciate what it is they're trying to impart and all the effort that they've put into that and help them get to where they need to be. And that for me is part of my passion. I absolutely love it. And that technical background plays into this. And there is nothing more satisfying. And I have so many examples over the years and a few fun ones. There's nothing more satisfying than being at an event like the Contact Center Awards, the CCA, and hearing one of your customers talk about the solution that you've delivered and the benefits that it had brought. But remembering when you started that journey, they were somewhat resistive. I can recall an example of stating what the solution would do and being shut down. And kind of rightly so retrospectively, but then hearing this particular individual standing up and saying, Stephen was right. It wasn't about being right, but you learn from that. You learn how to represent that. So yeah, I think it's knowing where you take these things and what you do with them. And there are methodologies that should be employed as well that are quite often overlooked. I've been dealing with a few startup organizations recently, and I've been working them through MEDIC or MEDPIC or MEDPICR, they're variations of that, and explaining why that's useful and how that will help them. And it has, in fact, they've grown their pipeline. And then there are other approaches that you can take that are important, but sometimes it's an amalgamation of all of those together. So there's lots. We could spend all day on this, you realize.
Yes, the time's flying, right? So Stephen, I really appreciate the exchange with you and also the advices you give. It's very charming, I have to say, and also very knowledgeable for me. I would like to ask you a question with respect to data automation, right? I would like to understand, let's say, your perspective of the, let's say, importance of the combination of AI, data automation, and sales.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. AI is here. It's not new. I'm not sure what iteration it's at the moment. Generative AI is relatively new in terms of people's understanding, obviously, of it. AI is not going to go away. AI is, for me anyway, a benefit. It's something that those of us who picked up and run with it will quickly realize that it will help automate certain processes, but it has to be from the point of view of rolled out logically. So if I think about observability, AI there is taking tens of billions of potential interactions and it's condensing those down into one problem. And in that one problem, it's saying, here is the business impact and here is the root cause. That's mighty powerful, because as human beings, you and I cannot deal with hundreds of thousands of alerts, force alerts. Which one of those alerts is important to us? So in that respect, using AI to help those automation processes and bringing technologies together to further automate those processes is saving time. Now, before I carry on with that, interestingly, from a sales perspective, when I was at Dictaphone, I had a secretary, and a shared secretary, to be honest, but a secretary. I could phone her at the end of the day or during the day and say, would you send out, I mean, this is showing how old I am now. In those days, it was letters. But would you take paragraph 1 out, add paragraph 2 in from, sheet 4, and I could build a letter up, and those would all go out at the end of my meetings to my prospective customers or existing customers. And then we were handed these laptops, they're big, thick bricks, and I suddenly had to realize things that I hadn't considered before. I need to type, so we kind of took a step backwards because those secretaries were let go. And suddenly we were doing more in the same amount of time, and we weren't doing it as efficiently. And so automation from a sales perspective, anything that helps you automate that process is a benefit, an absolute benefit. And that then comes back into there's one VP sales I work with in the States who took Salesforce to a level I have not seen before. Again, he will know who he is if you happen to watch this. But he helped automate the process of closing stages. So, in any given sales scenario, you'll have stages that you go through from that initial interest through to actually hopefully succeeding in winning the business. And so if you take that and then you automate into that things like MedPick, so that they are providing you from a sales management perspective with a clear view of what's happening, those are very beneficial. The other thing I would just touch on here as well is data, big data. Big data is not going away. There's this sheer volume of data that's coming at us every day. And again, AI is going to help us sift through that and get to the important stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. Very interesting, insights you just shared with me. I mean, the time flies, as I already said, and I'm very glad to speak with you today. And finally, I would like to ask you a last, let's say, a question, or maybe, if you can share with me a kind of an anecdote for our listeners and our watchers.
Yeah, okay. I've been thinking about this one. And again, the problem is there are so many scenarios to walk through. But I think sales is a game of fun. And Shakespeare summed it up for me. I'm a big Shakespeare fan. Love all, trust a few, do wrong to none. If you like what you're doing and you enjoy what you're doing, and I've seen on some of your other webinars, you asked that question about how do you balance work and life? If you love what you're doing, it comes naturally. But in sales, you have to learn when to say no. You have to know when an RFI or an RFP or an ITT or whatever name it's given comes to you, that it might not be right for you. And that's another thing that you have to be bold enough to say to the CEO, the CTO, the CFO, whoever it might be you're dealing with, that we should really step away from this one. I had an example of a very well-known airline who spent 2.5 years engaging with us and never took a project forward with anyone. That's detrimental to the business. The other quick thing I think that comes to mind, I really think this is worth mentioning: own your mistakes. I have seen sales directors employ people that were not right for the business. And to be fair to the people that they've employed, they should be letting them go sooner. And to the business as well. You know, there's a responsibility back to the business. So own your mistakes, whatever those may be. If you've bought a CRM system that is not appropriate, own it. Have the courage to say, this isn't working for us. You know, but at the same time, the owner, founders, C-level, you call them what you like, have to actually be prepared to let people. It's that trust. I made a mistake. You know, I recently did a presentation that was terrible. I should have stepped through it with ease, but I was so keen to win this piece of business that I went too far the other way. You know, own those mistakes, take a step back and say, what can I do better? Like I say, there's so many you can. There's so many. There are so many.
And that is wrapping up our enlightening episode of today's The Mentor Talk. So thank you so much, Stephen. It was a pleasure talking to you. And some final words from my side, not so wonderful and so insightful as yours, but anyhow, I'm closing now with remember, success is a journey, and having the guidance and the wisdom of an experienced professional like, for example, Stephen Sinclair, is making all the difference. And if you have any kind of feedback about today's episode, or if you would like to get support by today's expert, Stephen Sinclair, or you would like to become part of this mentoring experience of Sales Pro for You, please reach out to me at mentor@salesproforyou.com. So have a wonderful day. I hope the weather is nice in UK, and I hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was nice meeting you too.